it is the case that there might be some towns that will lose factories because of trade. Again, I do believe a large portion of why factories closed down was automation and not trade. We just have to think of what's best for the U.S. overall, and I think trade has a lot of benefits in terms of, everyone in the U.S., for example, just getting access to cheap goods.
The European Union, for example, why are they tariffing American trade?
Numbers that Trump says the EU is tariffing us are just an outright lie.
If the economy was destroyed by Trump the first time, why were things cheaper all the way up until the pandemic?
If you want to see more content like this, I would really appreciate you liking and subscribing. It really helps with the algorithm. And make sure to check out the Discord and other social links in the description.
As I said, the debate topic will be whether or not you think the tariffs are a good thing, and what you guys each think the long term will be. So, I should probably come up with an instance, shouldn't I? Yeah. What do you guys think about the Canadian thing? So, what's going on with that exactly? There's a new dude, new Prime Minister of Canada. He's getting he's getting to be a spicy boy over Donald Trump. Where do you?
The Canadians are definitely upset.
Yeah. Where do y'all think that'll go?
I don't have super strong opinions on the, leader himself, Mark Carney or whatever. I'm not in Canada. Yeah. I don't pay a ton of attention to politics, but I think, generally speaking, we benefit from our trade relationship with Canada, and I would like the tariffs in Canada to go down as soon as possible. Now, I don't necessarily know if what's more conducive to that is Mark Carney being aggressive towards Trump versus being more lenient towards Trump, because I think it's likely Trump will find a new thing to be mad about next month, basically no matter what Mark Carney concedes on this month. But I do know Trump could stop these tariffs at any time, and the Senate actually did stop the Canadian tariffs, at least some of them. And I think the Senate should probably stop the rest of the tariffs too, but they have failed to do so.
Aren't Canadian and American and Mexican, they have a special trade relationship?
Right. So currently, right now, you're correct. Donald Trump, we had NAFTA, and then Donald Trump basically renegotiated NAFTA a little bit to have the USMCA.
Hold on. I had you guys muted. I am so sorry.
So we were just talking about America's special trade relationship with Canada and Mexico.
Right.
Okay.
So currently...
Sorry, y'all didn't really miss too much. Sorry about that, Ashes. Thanks for letting me know, everybody. That was my own fault. I had Google muted.
On my stream, no one was muted. I'm just saying, chat. But
yeah, that's right.
Regardless.
That's why people were leaving. I'm like, oh, shit, okay. Now they're back, though. They're back. And
welcome back, everyone.
Yeah.
Sorry, but that was totally on me.
I'm of the position that we benefit from our trade relationship with Canada, especially because we've had, you're correct, we have had a special relationship with Canada for decades now, which means our supply chains are incredibly integrated with Canada. And that means a lot of what we get from Canada are, what we call intermediate goods. They're goods used to make other goods, and tariffing those goods is, I would say, particularly bad. And you're right.
Raw materials.
Raw materials are, an example of intermediate goods. They're not necessarily the only example, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you see, my position, your position on tariffs is that you're opposed to them, right? Correct.
Generally speaking, I'm not going to say 100% I'm opposed to every single tariff that could possibly exist, but I would say generally speaking, there are gains from trade, and tariffs restrict that from happening.
I mean, my position, I'm more I'm independent. I lean a certain way. I lean right, center right, but I'm independent, and I'm not American, so I have a different perspective on these matters. And I agree. I think I understand what Trump is trying to do, right? But I do recognize that tariffs can be very dangerous for an economy, and they can be very negative. And I know in the past they have been very there's a reason why people turned away from tariffs or protectionism, and there's a reason why these trade agreements were created. And I think a mutually beneficial trade relationship where both sides benefit is what's needed. I do know that the United States has trade deficits, and they are losing money, but I don't think that's the only thing that's beneficial to the economy. I think government spending is a big problem, and debt is a big problem. I'm not sure that debt is as big a problem as everyone thinks it is. The United States is still the biggest economy in the world, the most powerful economy in the world.
Right.
And it will be, I think, for a long time. I mean, I understand that he wants to bring manufacturing and American corporations back to the United States, and I don't see that happening.
Okay. So, I don't see it happening. I don't necessarily. There's 4 big issues I have with that, which, I mean, if you're not interested in that happening, we don't have to really get into it. But I would say, 1, I think people exaggerate to the extent to which, manufacturing has declined in America. I think if you look at, output, especially in defense relevant sectors, that's actually increased over this time period. 2, I think people exaggerate basically trade's role in to the extent that it has declined. People exaggerate the role that trade played. For example, unemployment unambiguously in the manufacturing sector has declined, but a lot of that just has to do with productivity increases and automation rather than trade. 3, I don't think that universal tariffs are conducive to bringing manufacturing back. That's why we've seen surveys from the Dallas Fed, Philadelphia Fed, and New York Fed, which all separately survey manufacturers in their state. All these manufacturing companies expect their businesses to be harmed because of the higher cost that tariffs are imposing on them. And 4, there may be certain defense-specific sectors where I believe it is important to protect them, but overall, I see no reason to value manufacturing jobs over any other type of job. And because I believe that trade increases the total number of job opportunities, I'm going to, I think there's an opportunity cost to bringing manufacturing back. And I don't necessarily think that cost is worth it. I don't think it's good. I don't think it would be good for the U.S. to start making clothes again at the expense of exporting software. But I would agree. I'll let you respond to that, and then I can,
Sorry, I would agree that certain defense-specific like microchips or, warships or something, it would be good if the United States could for themselves to manufacture those things, not to be reliant on potential enemies for things. That doesn't make sense to me. But I understand what you're saying. There is an opportunity cost, and it's not like American unemployment is drastically high. I mean, as far as I can guess, what is it? Unemployment is like 5% or something?
4.2% right now.
That's pretty low. Yeah, I've seen economies where it's like 9, or I've seen it in really bad times where it's up to 20 or 30.
Right.
But that's like a long time ago. But the thing, what I think Trump is doing is, I think he's trying to, he's more extreme, and he's trying to get things, but he's asking for more, but he'll settle for less, is what I think. Ultimately. But I wonder about the European Union, for example. Like, why are they tariffing American trade to the degree that they are?
I think to a large extent, they aren't. Like, Trump's reciprocal tariffs, the numbers that Trump says the EU is tariffing us are just an outright lie. If you actually look at, what the EU is tariffing us at, I think they tariff us at like an effective average rate of 1.64%. And that is practically nothing. To the extent that they have tariffs, it's in large part because special interests are able to effectively lobby democratic governments for tariffs in their industry. And, I can explain this to you, but I would encourage the audience just to look up, rational ignorance. Essentially, there's something that happens where, because the benefits of tariffs are so concentrated, for example, the U.S. sugar tariffs are a really good example of this. Sugar companies in the U.S. benefit a lot from tariffs because their industry is protected. And every consumer in the U.S. has to bear the cost, but because there's so many consumers in the U.S., right, the cost per consumer is very small. So there's something called rational ignorance, where it is actually perfectly rational for consumers not to care about the sugar tariff because it is not worth the extra cost they pay in sugar each year to develop an understanding of the sugar tariff and then lobby Congress to get rid of the sugar tariff. So to a large extent, this is why other countries tariff us. And, it's notable that Trump specifically is lying to the extent at which these other countries tariff us. And it just, at the end of the day, it's not a big deal. We have plenty of tariffs in other countries, even pre-Trump. Our effective average tariff rate was like 2-3%. And that's almost what, Japan, Europe, our close trading partners are charging us.
You noticed when Trump and the China thing in his first administration, Biden kept them. Why do you think he did that?
I think there's basically two reasons. One, I'm not gonna. There were plenty of tariffs that Biden supported that I don't necessarily think were good. I'm not. I got Biden, but behind me. I'm not. I won't defend every single thing he does. But I think. So I think part of it is he might have just, gotten bad advice, or he might just genuinely not understand why tariffs are bad. He might just have a genuine difference of opinion. But I also think, another part of it is these people basically, politicians don't want to look weak, because a lot of times what happens when you tariff another country, that country responds by putting up their own tariff, and then, these politicians, even if economically would be good to just remove our tariffs, they don't want to remove the tariffs without the other country also removing tariffs, because then they look kind of weak. They kind of look like a pushover, and they don't want that happening.
So it's sort of like how
Biden
they do with the military and nuclear weapons, how they like mutual stand down or mutual armament, or how they arm up and down.
Yeah. And I actually really...
There is an element of diplomacy in these things, that I think... I think part of what might be driving Trump is that a lot of the European leaders or international leaders are very hostile to him, and domestic as well, I suppose, but there's an ego element to this,
Right. I'll bring up that I think Trump is usually pretty hostile to other leaders, and I think the tariffs even I think are an example of him being hostile to these other leaders. But
I mean, like where I am at the moment, I'm based in Ireland, and half of our trade is with the United States, and half of our trade is with Europe. And tariffs will probably hurt us. To a degree, but I can kind of sympathize with there's a sentiment in the United States that when NAFTA and when the WTO and when they opened up trade with China, that hurt them. It hurt the American economy, and it did. I would agree it did, but I would also say that the economy has adapted and changed and developed over that time. We're talking about a 30-year period. So while I think a lot of American states, were significantly hurt, other ones benefited, from trade, like the port cities and, the Los Angeles and the New Yorks of the world. And I can see why economically, it can make sense for an American corporation to outsource some work to Mexico or China or Canada, and that it's still not that negative a benefit to the, it doesn't hurt the United States as much as it appears to certain people. I can understand that, right? But I can also understand that if you I only saw a part of your debate, but I saw you guys made an argument about fruit, importing fruit to the United States. And I was kind of thinking, when I heard that, I was thinking of in the old days, you used to have the United Fruit Company, and now it's Chiquita or something it's called, like for the bananas and things. And I know that they have since they moved out of the United States. I mean, they're based out of Switzerland now.
So, right. So there's a few things I'll respond to. One, I don't entirely, I think you are right in saying that, trade essentially has localized costs, but diffuse benefits. And sometimes you are right, it has concentrated benefits in like certain superstar cities. So it could be the case that, a factory's offshored and resources will be reallocated over time from the Rust Belt to, sort of superstar cities on the coast and everything. But I think, it's just important to focus on what is best for the U.S. overall. And I think, generally speaking, that is free trade. And, it is the case that there might be some towns that will lose factories because of trade. Again, I do believe a large portion of why factories closed down was automation and not trade. I think it was probably, I think automation probably counts for at least 60% of it. But we just have to think of what's best for the U.S. overall. And I think trade has a lot of benefits in terms of, everyone in the U.S., for example, just getting access to cheap goods, businesses getting access to cheap goods, which means they can buy cheap inputs and make more goods, and consumers save money, and consumers can spend that extra money in other sectors. There's just a lot of benefits from trade that we should take into account when we say this specific area is kind of getting fucked over a little bit. And there are transition costs, and I want to minimize them via some type of redistribution, some type of welfare state. I don't think
strategic investment.
What'd you say? Sorry.
Or strategic investment.
Well, I think So I think the case for strategic investments is usually going to be in defense sectors, not necessarily just not necessarily. I think it's my position would basically be that we should a lot of times subsidize workers and not like subsidize the job. So if there's a job
I was reading some news in the United States this year. You know, a lot of American corporations are investing in the local economy, is what I'm getting at. You know, and I think that will have a good effect over the coming years for the United States.
I mean, you will see headlines about, you know, companies investing, you know, X amount of money into wherever. So I think there's two important things to focus on. One is that the way tariffs are being rolled out right now is causing a incredible amount of uncertainty. Like business uncertainty is like literally higher, or at least was higher than COVID. Businesses don't know what tariffs are going to remain in place. They don't know what tariffs Trump is going to announce tomorrow, what exemptions Trump is going to announce tomorrow. And we know we have studies on this, and it just makes sense also logically that uncertainty generally reduces business investment. So
it does, yeah. Confidence is key.
Right. So exactly.
I understand that.
So if we want businesses to invest locally, we should at the very least not roll out tariffs the way we're doing it now. It's totally insane. I think Trump is a lunatic for doing it this way. And I also think, you know, it's important to look at sort of the aggregate, right? Because I would say tariffs will cause, you know, no one is denying that tariffs, at least on final goods, will incentivize the production of that final good domestically. The important part is that it has cost in other sectors. It has cost not just to, you know, consumers who now have to pay more for goods. It has cost for other businesses. So, for example, if we buy less imported goods, that essentially means we're supplying less dollars to other countries. Because when we buy goods from China, you know, if we have a trade deficit with China, basically we're supplying dollars to China, and China now has those dollars. If we start supplying less dollars to China or any other country because we start buying less imported goods, what happens is exchange rates appreciate. That's the, you know, the dollar gets stronger relative to other currencies because the supply of dollars overseas is falling. And that means, for example, U.S. exporters are hurt because now other countries have to pay more for U.S. dollars. And it's also just, I mean, the easiest way to understand it is, you know, tariffs can shift investment by shifting the relative profitability of industries. They can make making clothing relatively more profitable, but that makes other things relatively less profitable, right? That's why it's relative. Which that means you're drawing resources away from other sectors for this domestic investment, and you're not necessarily increasing like aggregate investment. I think that's the big thing to focus on. And I will add just one more thing. You know, we should the reason that, you know, the market is good at, generally speaking, allocating, you know, what production should be done in the U.S. versus what production should be done in other countries based on, you know, comparative advantage, economies of scale, the relative abundance of resources in each country. When we institute a tariff, domestic resources are going to produce something that could be imported for cheaper, whilst those domestic resources could have been used for something else. That is the opportunity cost. That is the deadweight loss. That is why this is bad.
I understand. Yeah, I can see that. There's also the factor of government spending, you know, and also the general economic state of the rest of the world, you know, how their economies are growing or conflicts. I mean, Ukraine hurt people. You know, the Ukraine war is a good example of, you know, like that drove the oil prices up, you know, or the relative tax position. I think what's your position on taxes, on corporate taxes? Do you think they should be higher or lower?
So it's weird because corporate income tax specifically, I would say we should get rid of in its entirety. I don't like corporate income taxes, but there's another type of tax called a destination-based cash flow tax, which is similar to a corporate income tax, but it's a lot better in that it basically allows for what's called full expensing, immediate full expensing of capital investment. So basically you're only, you know, right now there are like depreciation schedules where like if a company invests in, you know, X factory or whatever, they can like depreciate that factory over time. And that distorts decisions over how to invest. But A DBCFT just taxes the company's cash flow. At the end of the year, whether they have positive or negative cash flow, and in effect, that allows for the what's called again full expensing of capital investments, meaning, any money I spend building this factory is not going to be taxed, and I'm actually not even going to be taxed on my normal returns to it. So if I spend $50,000 building a factory and I get $50,000 in revenue, I'm still not even taxed. I have zero cash flow, so I'm not taxed on it. You only get taxed on your super normal returns above the amount.
I recall with Amazon. I mean, I remember they spent 10 years reinvesting all of their profits in expanding their business and not paying really any tax.
Yeah.
But they generated an awful lot of money. They became one of the biggest corporations in the world doing that.
Right. So, I mean, again, Amazon didn't pay literally zero tax. The way corporate income tax works, if you don't have
income, yeah.
If it is true, there are ways to get around it. You do, we don't try to tax investment with the corporate income tax, but again, because we have things like depreciation schedules where you can only depreciate your investments over longer periods of time, we essentially do end up taxing investment. And I think that's a really bad thing. And I do actually think it would incentivize companies to, stay here, or at least headquarters here, if we did a DBCFT, or really any type of destination-based tax. Because, currently we kind of have an origin-based tax system where we tax goods based on where the company's headquartered and everything. And that means companies can do a lot of shady things where they're like, oh, we're actually a company based in the Bahamas, even though all our production takes place in the U.S., and we sell everything in the U.S.
A lot of U.S. corporations are headquartered in Ireland,
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, you guys are, a tax haven, yeah.
It's a tax haven, yeah.
And a DBCFT would kind of avoid those issues because the DB stands for destination-based, meaning you're taxing goods based on where they are consumed, essentially. You're taxing them not based on the origin of the country where they're headquartered, but based on the production that actually goes on in the U.S.
You see, what worries me about the economy is I think we can sort of agree on tariffs. This is a thing. I would support Trump, but I'm not I'm not saying he's perfect, and I'm not what do you call it? I'm not fanatical. If you make a reasonable point, I'll agree with it. And I know from history that, especially with them, tariffs were introduced to protect, local farms, but it hurt the U.S. economy. It's a short-term solution to a long-term problem, and free trade is the long-term solution that everyone needs. And mutually beneficial trade agreement, especially with allied countries, is the best for both parties. And the United States is going to be the United States no matter what. I worry about China, long term, but I'm talking long term. They're still. I mean, as far as I can tell, they're still on coal power a lot of the time.
Yeah.
Well, I believe the U.S. is largely on coal power. I believe.
I don't think that's our biggest
coal
thing
to
anymore.
Power our electrical plants. I personally think that we should go to nuclear power plants because they're more safe than anybody wants to give them credit for.
I used to be very anti-nuclear, but that was based on the older technology and the Chernobyl type thing, but things are much safer now. And I do, energy, nuclear, modern nuclear reactors are, and I believe the new, the Chinese have worked on a new thorium reactor, which is even cleaner and safer. Nice. That's a thing we could look into.
Yeah, I got to look into a lot of this kind of stuff just for personal queries. You know what I mean? Got to watch those queries. Anyways, I was going to ask you guys, what do you think the long-term effects or actually, what do you think the long-term goal would be for the tariffs? Do you think that the end goal is getting equal tariffs across the board with other countries, or do you think that they're being so spicy with the tariff announcements because they want to eventually just make them null, zero across the board?
I mean, based on how these have been rolled out, and based on how many statements Trump's Trump will have Peter Navarro say something, and then Steve Bessett will contradict him, and then Howard Lutnick will come in and contradict them both, and then like we have footage of like one of Trump's advisors being informed, like, you know, on the I think it was they're testifying in front of Congress when he got the like news that Trump had just announced a pause in tariffs. Based on all of that, I would say it just seems like there's no coherent plan coming from the Trump administration. It really does not seem like it. That's why, by the way, when Japan was over here to negotiate, they did not get a deal done. And Japan said, you know, we were offering decent concessions to the U.S. It's just they did not have a clear goal. They didn't know what they wanted. And I think that's likely true. I don't think there's any coherent plan or strategy. I think Trump is a lunatic, and he has chosen economists to surround himself with who are, for some reason, willing to go with his lunacy.
Well, I mean, the guy's done stocks for a large part of his life. I think he's using a similar play, right? Because with stock market, sometimes you got to make last minute decisions. And with this, it's a mixture of stock and I think mob mentality in a way. Shane, what do you think?
You can appear mad, yet there can be method to the madness. I'm thinking of Khrushchev in the 60s. You know, his goal was to get U.S. nuclear missiles out of Turkey. So, he provoked the Cuban Missile Crisis, you know, right? And, you know, that was very scary, you know, in the short term. But in the end, you got a START treaty out of it that, you know, led to reduced nuclear, you know, proliferation and a kind of détente in the Cold War, you know. You know, I agree that I know the clip you're talking about, that the hearing when that news came out, and it's a very good clip, actually. But I think a lot of this is like, you know, we're still in the first 100 and something days of the administration, so that's things are settling down, or they will settle down. I think we can start fairly. I think the left can start fairly attacking him now, depending on what happens in the next few months. You know, whereas in the first 100 days, you got to give him a little grace to set up the administration. You know, I would agree that if he handles this poorly, he will get creamed in the midterms.
I think he's already handled it poorly. I think, quite frankly, you know, I was skeptical. First of all, I was skeptical Trump would even follow through on, you know, 10% universal tariff. And so far, it seems like he's done that. I was skeptical that, you know, tariffs would be able to, you know, potentially cause a recession. I'm not saying we're in a recession yet. Personally, I was wrong about this quarter's GDP numbers. I thought that they would be positive. They ended up being negative. I thought, personally, I still think quarter two will be positive. I could end up being wrong, though. We'll see. At which point, some people say we're in a recession.
I've heard him drop a quote, stick with me until September and you'll see. I've heard him say that.
I think Trump just looks for any excuse to try to deflect responsibility for what he's done, for all the uncertainty he's caused, all the, reduced investment, or depending on how you measure it, reduced investment. I understand, because inventories have been built up, reduced investment is on paper gone up, but that's inventories front running the tariffs. I think Trump is just looking for a way to avoid responsibility. That's why he says it's Biden's economy.
Would you agree that the full effect of his policy haven't been felt yet?
Yes, but that's what's really concerning to me, is that, you know, even the Q1 GDP thing, that was before the Liberation Day tariffs were even announced. So I agree. Trump's tariffs have not had. Hold on, just real quick. I agree. Trump's tariffs have not had any of their major effects yet. That's why I'm so fucking terrified, because I think the effects. All the theory states that. All the theory from textbooks and everything states this. Tariffs. The effects of tariffs are negative. All the empirical evidence confirms it. The effects of tariffs are negative. That's why I'm so fucking scared that we genuinely could end up in a recession because of these tariffs.
Yeah, but recessions occur. You know, I'm not so worried about recession. I'm worried about how recession is managed. You know, because we've had recessions before.
I mean, I actually agree with you there, which gets into Fed independence. I can talk a little bit about that. But like recessions, you know, recessions don't just happen. Like, there are causes behind them. Now, we don't always know the causes behind them and everything. But if there is a recession in the U.S., unambiguously, it is primarily because of Donald Trump's tariffs. That is unambiguously true. If there's a recession in we know next quarter GDP numbers are negative. Unambiguously, Trump's tariffs played a major role in that, and it's good. A recession is bad, folks. I don't know what to tell you. Unemployment is bad.
Recessions are bad, but the last recession was caused over Democrat economic policy, as memory serves.
The last recession was caused by COVID primarily.
Oh, well, sorry, I was
exiting that.
Sorry, I wasn't talking about COVID. I meant, I was talking about like 08 crash type.
The 2008 crisis was probably not caused by Democratic policy. The 2008 crisis was caused by overly tight monetary policy. If the Fed had been targeting in GDP, it wouldn't have happened.
I think it goes back to Clinton's 1996 policy.
In the chat, Mexican guy says, there's been a recession since I turned 18, since Bush and Obama. I think I can kind of agree that they've been talking recession since I was in fucking middle school. They've been like, we're in a recession. It's like, okay, I get you.
People always try to predict recessions. People are always predicting gloom, and economists turn out to be wrong most of the time. But again, most recessions don't happen because a president announced a bad policy.
But that's the problem, though, is that there's always somebody predicting bad stuff, and then you got the people that go out there and they take it at face value and go, you know what, that guy's right. That happened a lot during Trump's first administration when they kept saying like, oh, this is going to fuck up the economy. Well, why then, if the economy was destroyed by Trump the first time, why were things cheaper all the way up until the pandemic? And we should probably just call it the pandemic, I guess. But all the way up until that, and then during I almost call him Biden, I just watched everything get more and more expensive. And I mean, from computer hardware all the way to, of course, eggs.
Look, I mean, I don't think almost anything with that has to do with tariffs. I think primarily...
No, they didn't.
Right. So I think, if you look at the evidence from Trump's first term, first of all, I will say, Trump did not do that big of tariffs during his first term, but the tariffs he did do...
He dropped a couple, though.
He did do, and I was about to say...
The tariffs China mostly, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was mostly on China and, all steel coming into the U.S., but, if you look at the tariffs he did do, a lot of, those did increase prices. It did increase the price of washing machines. It did increase the price of steel.
Very good.
It unambiguously did, but
it seemed like...
but yeah, so
board things were getting more expensive during the last administration.
No, so you're not wrong. Like inflation obviously was lower under Trump's first term than it was under Biden. But look, first of all, I'm not convinced the president has much control over inflation generally. I think the economy was in a decent place during Trump's first term, and I don't think Trump did anything major to fuck it up. I think COVID caused... So first of all, under Biden, which COVID started under Trump, to be fair. First of all, we did see a negative supply shock. We did see factories in China close down. Factories all over the country closed down. Supply chains got clogged up, and that unambiguously caused some amount of inflation. Some amount of inflation was caused by supply shocks outside of Biden's control, outside of Trump's control. That is part of the reason inflation spiked under Biden, and that's inflation spiked. Globally, we saw inflation globally. Inflation was not localized to the U.S.
That's correct.
Inflation was everywhere because it was a global supply chain crisis. Secondly, also unambiguously, the Federal Reserve printed a lot of money during COVID. That had some effect on inflation. Again, outside of Trump's control, outside of Biden's control. Notably, I had this conversation with Trippy a little bit earlier. I remember most of the money printed was printed under Trump.
I got a donation.
Trump printed most of the money.
So give it a sec. Sure. Sorry, I should have unmuted him. All right, sorry about that. That was PFletch donated, and my animation came up. He says, "Nonfun, how much of a Harry Sisson fanboy are you?" I don't know if he knows who Harry Sisson even is.
Free Harry Sisson. Free Harry Sisson. Can a man not chase a little tail these days? What the hell is going on with wokeness these days? What the fuck? Free Harry Sisson. Free Harry Sisson.
I'll say that the guy comes off a lot more into dudes than I thought he was. Okay.
A man's private affairs are his own concern.
That's what I'm saying.
I really don't care, yeah. I really don't care if he was talking to 20 and 30 women. I don't watch the guy, and I never knew who he was up until about a week before that went down. And I had seen a couple of his videos, and I'm like, well, whatever. I mean, he's over there doing his thing, you know?
Right.
I mean, as long as it was
look,
consensual, I don't care.
Yeah, all of it. That's what's great. All of it was consensual. He just basically, at worst, you can say like, I think he may have insinuated to some woman. I haven't read over all the logs. I don't care that much that like he was exclusive with them when he turned out not to be fully exclusive with them or whatever. But he's just can a man not have a few side hoes? But anyway, regardless.
Yeah, no. What's the world coming to?
Supply shocks did have an effect on inflation. Monetary policy did have an effect on inflation. Most of the money that got printed was printed under Donald Trump. Donald Trump did not control that. He's not the head of the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve makes those decisions independently. And, unambiguously, the increase in deficit spending also had an effect on inflation. Now, there were 2 stimulus bills passed under Trump. Those were inflationary. Biden passed a stimulus bill as well. I'm not going to deny the American Rescue Plan probably had some effect on inflation. The question
Can
is,
I get a stimulus check?
There's just 2 questions we have to answer. One, what is the relative importance of these 3 factors? And I would say, I think deficit spending was probably about a third of inflation. I don't think it was much more than that, and that is the only thing really from the president's control. And the second thing we have to consider is, well, what did we get out of it? Well, the U.S. after COVID was in a really good position, partly because we, did deficit spending, we printed money, we did what we were supposed to do, we, stopped any demand slump from happening. Unemployment was under 3% or under 4% for like 20 something months straight or whatever. GDP growth, real GDP growth, so even inflation adjusted GDP growth was really higher than any other G7 country. And inflation was able to be brought down relatively quickly once the Fed started acting. Inflation was brought down faster than a lot of other countries. So I think the U.S. ended up in a really good position post-COVID. I think we had a really good economy post-COVID for most of Biden's term even, despite the inflation. And Trump is nuking that with a bunch of tariffs.
Well, I think, hang on. Well, I think, just give me a second with this. I think that after post-08, you have the Obama administration, right? And the recovery period, right? And I think a lot of what happened during that administration, especially the second term, gave Trump a bump in his administration. Not as big a bump as some would say, but then certain economic policies he enacted helped as well, and that was good, right? So that was some of what was the good economics of his first term. And then you had COVID, right? And COVID kind of brought the international economy had just about recovered from 08 when COVID happened. So then we had another, and like you say, there were positive steps made. And I think the thing that what I felt hurt the U.S. economy was Biden on day one stopping oil production. That didn't help,
So Biden on day one, I think Biden canceled the Keystone pipeline. I think even that there's some nuances around. I've never looked into it. But I mean, look, I don't think holistically Biden was necessarily bad for energy policy. First of all, the Inflation Reduction Act approved a ton of subsidies for green energy, and I think green energy is just a good thing. And not only is energy good, but if we are going to make energy, we should probably have it be green. And Biden, when we needed to, did dip into the petroleum reserve to try to bring down the price of oil. Biden did go back on his promise to not approve fracking permits. Biden approved a ton of fracking. Biden approved more oil drilling permits than Trump did. So Biden, when he needed to, did absolutely say we need to drill oil. And that's why we became the number 1 producer of oil and an energy independent nation under Biden. We to my knowledge, we still are the number 1 producer of oil. What'd you say?
I want all of Earth's blood in our cars. That's what we need. Just empty this bitch.
Right, but I mean, yeah, I mean, I think, Biden did, when we needed to, drill oil, and that's why we started drilling a fuck ton of oil. We became...
What I noticed was when that pipeline was stopped, and he stopped drilling on federal land, temporarily at least, that had a negative... Then America was sort of... There was a short-term buying of oil from overseas, and that sort of raised the price on oil. And then you also had, a conflict internationally, which also escalated the price. Inflation was, I was talking to a guy who worked for Vanguard. He did, he was noticing that like the official inflation rate, and the actual inflation rate that most American households are feeling are two different figures.
Well, what do you mean by that? I think there's I think people play a lot of games with alternative inflation metrics, and most of them are pretty bad. I think the official metrics of CPI and PCE usually do a pretty good job, and I actually think CPI overestimates inflation a lot of times. But
yeah, I just you gotta ask, like, I know it's hard for certain people to understand, because the relative value of currency and then the general inflation. I'm just saying, like, a lot of people were hurt by inflation in the last term, in the last administration, and I'm not one of these people that like, oh, it's all his fault or it's all X fault. And there's multiple factors that come into this. I'm just saying, a lot of people, like, big business is one thing, but then there's the average family, which is another.
And I mean, again, the relevant question is, the relevant two questions are, how much is Biden responsible? To which I said, from the reading I've done, which, there's endless discussion among economists over how much inflation was caused by the Fed versus supply shocks versus deficit spending. But from the reading I've done, I'd say 30%, maybe even less, of inflation was caused by deficit spending. And then what do we get out of it? Again, unemployment was really low. Wage growth, even real wage growth, was really strong, especially for the lowest income earners. Now, measuring real wage growth and real income growth is actually a lot harder than you might expect. So I'm not comfortable saying that wages outpaced inflation holistically, but certainly for the bottom 10-20% of people, it seems like they did get a decent wage boost during COVID. There was a really tight labor market post-COVID, and that did benefit a lot of people. And again, I just think at the end of Biden's term, the economy was in a good place, partly due to his policies, so partly just because the economy sort of naturally recovers, and because the Federal Reserve acts independently as well. And Trump, again, is nuking that. He's nuking that. He's throwing a wrench in all of it for no good reason.
Well,
I see him. No, I agree. He's throwing a wrench. I definitely agree with that. But I don't, and I can see that it can go very badly. Right, I agree with that. Right, but I'm not comfortable being assured that it's going to go badly, and I'm not saying there. I think there could be a solution midway through this thing. Like when cooler heads prevail. Because if he.
So, I mean, first, really, I'll say he's already done a lot of damage. Like, there's already been, like, we already have a negative GDP print for quarter one. Now, it actually, maybe I'm too optimistic. It actually would not surprise me if, later revisions show GDP in quarter one was actually positive. It wouldn't surprise me. But he's already done a fuck ton of damage. Quarter two could actually be worse. We're going to see, from my understanding, I'm not a supply chain expert. It seems like it may already be too late to avoid shortages in the summer, simply because a lot of ports right now in Seattle and LA are simply empty, or have 60% reduced output going through them, or input coming in. And it takes a while from ships to get to China, and then it takes even longer once the goods arrive at a port to get to Texas, to get to the East Coast. So in the summer, we very well could see shortages right now. There
are still intermittent shortages for COVID related, in Europe, in certain goods.
Right, but here's the COVID was not caused by a lunatic saying I'm going to, unless lab leak or maybe who knows, but COVID in the U.S. was not caused by Joe Biden or Donald Trump saying I'm going to tank the economy. This is absolutely. No,
I don't blame Biden for COVID.
I'm just pointing out to you there is a difference between a real shock caused by something outside of our control and a policy decision made by a president, essentially unilaterally.
I mean, a lot of people would argue that it's more of an economic reset. So, we want to change the way that things are done. And it's been said by multiple presidents that we need to fix the tariff issues. I know for a fact that Obama mentioned it quite a few times. And he even mentioned reciprocal tariffs back when he was president. he didn't go through with it like this. But I mean, even at the time, I mean, hell, the internet wasn't as prominent. You know what I mean? Like there wasn't as much new media. Hell, they might have just been starting, if it was starting at all. And like there's a lot more coverage of this kind of thing going around YouTube, Twitter, TikTok, Twitch.
I mean,
you know what I mean? There's a lot more coverage of it, so it's right in your face,
right?
No matter where you go. Plus, the Trump administration loves using internet media, social media sites and stuff like that. They love posting things. They love doing, memes, all that stuff. They're trying to use it to their advantage. And obviously, the previous administration was kind of, they were dipping their toe, but they weren't doing it to this degree. And
right. I would just say, if you're of my opinion, which I think is founded on a lot of good economic theory and a lot of good empirical evidence, that trade increases growth, trade increases wages, trade increases job opportunities. Like the end goal of this reset or whatever is just going to be the United States being overall more poor. It's going to be wages in the United States being lower than they otherwise would have been. And I also say, I would just like everyone in the audience, and you guys should do this. Just look up the graph of the effective average tariff rate. I'm not going to deny Democrats have never done tariffs or never talked about tariffs or anything. No. I'm sure Obama has, but look at the line. It's really big around 1870s. It kind of goes down. It kind of spikes during Smoot-Hawley, the Great Depression, and then it goes down, and then it stays at less than 5% for decades, until Donald Trump recently, when it shoots right back up to almost Smoot-Hawley levels. This is an insane, unprecedented, fucking chaotic decision made by Donald Trump unilaterally. This is not something Democrats would have ever approved of. That's not something even most Republicans now approve of. It's just that they're too cucked out to actually vote against it. But I guarantee you, if it was an anonymous Senate vote,
the problem is, hang on,
95 senators against the tariff.
Just in the 1920s, right, you had the post-World War I situation, right? And then you had tariffs, was it the Taft Act, wasn't it? Under Taft, President, no, it was, who was the president in the 20s? It was Harding and then Taft, wasn't it?
I think. Sure. Are you talking about the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act? Is that the?
Yeah, I remember when tariffs were introduced to protect the American agriculture economy. It was like a 40% tariff rate, and it was very bad. And then you had the Wall Street crash. There was a post-war situation, a series of issues that led to uniquely tariffs being bad. That was not present afterwards. And I agree that I would argue that I don't disagree that tariffs like that are bad, right? I just think that there is a trade deficit the United States has. What is it? It's $100 billion a year deficit.
With what country? With everyone?
Internationally. Goods coming in and out.
So I think our trade deficit with everyone is $3 trillion a year. I think it's about 3% of GDP or something. I think it's but why do we think that? Here'd be my question. The US also runs capital account deficits. Do you think we should try to fix that too?
Yeah, I think there's multiple problems that need fixing,
right. So
I think
so look, I mean, the one of those accounts has to be in deficit, So the inverse, dollar for dollar, the inverse of the trade deficit is a capital.
So you mean
surplus.
balance of payments,
so the way to exactly, the balance of payments. So the way to think of this is when we give other countries our dollars, with trade deficits, that money doesn't really leave the country because dollars just aren't very good in China. Dollars are not very good in France. They buy.
They're only good for petrodollars, really.
What happens is these countries buy. They can either buy a U.S. good, in which case we don't have a trade deficit because it's good for good, or they buy U.S. assets, in which case we have a trade deficit, but we have a capital account surplus because money investment is flowing into the United States. And I even think there's a problem with saying that the trade deficit is associated with this flow of goods, because I think it's actually. I think it could be the case. It definitely, plausibly could be the case. And I think there's evidence to support this to an extent. It's the case in the U.S. The trade deficit can actually be determined by capital flows. If the U.S. is a good place to invest in, which we are, the U.S. equities have a higher rate of return than European equities, Japanese equities, a lot of Chinese equities. People will naturally want to invest in the U.S. We also have a lot of safe assets. You know, the U.S. Treasury bonds are deemed to be pretty safe because our government is pretty stable and we're a rich country. Up until recently,
there has been a lot of
but hold on, just real quick to finish this point. If a ton of people want to invest in the U.S., that means we're going to end up running a capital account surplus, which means by necessity, trade deficits. Those aren't a bad thing. Trade deficits can be mutually beneficial. You know, just as a capital account surplus can be mutually beneficial. Investment is a good thing. U.S. companies and businesses being able to buy the goods they want is a good thing. There's no reason to think these are per se bad things.
Yeah, and a certain level of debt isn't necessarily the end of the world. Like it can be a good thing, you know. Not like to the level that we have, you know, currently now. But there was something I wanted to say about what I'm worried about is that I think we have bigger problems than tariffs. You know, I see war coming. You know, I'm noticing, you know, 800 billion in extra spending in European defense sectors. I'm looking at like Ireland getting ready to mobilize. You know, there's a conflict coming. You know, it might not be in the next 4 years. I'm just saying, but there is trouble on the horizon, and that's a bigger problem.
Shane and Nonfon, both y'all. I actually heard. I don't remember who the hell I was watching that mentioned this, but a possible war between Pakistan and India.
Well, they've been hostile. They've been hostile since day one.
Well, they've got kind of a. They've got
Kashmir.
God damn, what do you call it? Fucking. Basically, it's like a Jewish state and non-Jewish state kind of thing. Just like with Iran and. Am I naming the right fucking places?
India is Hindu mostly, and Iran is Islam, or Pakistan is Islam.
Right. So Islamic State, non-Islamic State, whatever it is, non-Jewish. But yeah, I heard that they might end up going to fisticuffs. That'd be.
Oh yeah, they have gone to war several times.
I say let them go ahead and do it. We don't need to step our toe into that. They can just go ahead and bomb each other, shoot each other. It's fine.
Well, no, that would hurt. That would hurt because India is one of the biggest economies in the world. You know.
That's fine. It's fine. We don't need any more doctors. Anyway.
Well, you know, I will say, you know, I do believe that there is a
brings up a good point though. After Nonfon's done here.
Oh, sure. So I do believe that there's very good reasons to believe that, you know, the tariffs and especially the way Trump is doing them is undermining our national security and undermining our ability to have relationship with allies like, you know, Japan and Europe and Korea, who would be useful in any confrontation against China or even as strategic allies against India and Pakistan, because I mean he's no one's gonna want to work with the U.S. if we rip up the trade agreements we already have with them and impose insane tariffs on them and fuck them over. That's not conducive to a good relationship with our allies. And I do again believe that these universal tariffs hurt manufacturers by appreciating exchange rates, by the retaliatory tariffs placed on us, and by the increased cost for importing goods used that U.S. manufacturers need. So I'd say that. Yeah.
Well, I've heard everybody argue from tariffs are the best thing in the world. Of course, you know that's more of a Trump thing, but I've also heard people argue it's not the business that pays for it; it's the consumer. I've heard people say that it's not the consumer, it's the business. You know what I mean? Like I've heard both sides.
Well, yeah. So
Spirit brings up in the chat. He says before we had income tax, everything was paid for with tariffs.
Right. So
you know, prior to a lot of things.
Yeah. So if you want to talk about tariff incidents for a little bit, for a second, you know, tariffs are paid by people living in the U.S., right? If a company imports a good, they're the ones sending over the money to the Treasury. They may or may not choose to pass that added cost onto the consumer. A lot of times they do. It depends, you know, that depends on a lot of things, but they are, at the end of the day, paid by U.S. companies. There may, maybe, sometimes may there may be exporters in other countries that are essentially willing to lower the cost of their goods to try to negate some of the effect of the tariff. But the empirical evidence is pretty clear on this. They don't seem to be willing to do that generally. It seems like the people in the U.S., pay up. The incidence is like 90% people in the U.S. These companies may lower prices 10% or whatever, but it just does not negate the effect of the tariff. And by the way, just if the tariffs aren't paid by people in the U.S., then how are they having this effect of bringing manufacturing back? If people don't have to pay more for foreign goods, people are going to continue buying foreign goods. So like you negate the possible benefits of bringing manufacturing back. But responding to the income tax point, I mean, look, so a big reason why the U.S. had tariffs instead of income tax, and a lot of developing countries still have tariffs now, higher tariffs now, is because it's just a lot of times when we have low state capacity, it's just relatively easy to keep track of things coming into your country and like charge a tax at ports rather than calculating the income of everyone in the country, right? It doesn't mean that tariffs may not be a more efficient tax than income tax. They might just be easier to implement. Secondly, whatever problems you have with income tax, and I don't like income tax personally, it does not incite other foreign countries to retaliate. No country puts tariffs on the U.S. because we have income tax. They will put tariffs on us because we tariff them. That's a downside that basically only tariffs have. And also, when we funded everything with tariffs, federal government spending was like 3% of GDP. You might want to reduce federal government spending now, which is at like 18% of GDP. I think it's 26% of GDP. But that's going to require a lot more painful cuts to things that people like. That's not going to be useful. It's not going to be. That's way more politically harder than just doing these tariffs and not cutting spending, right? Like,
as far as I know, like income tax was a temporary emergency measure to help pay for the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. And I think governments, once they get a new power or a new tax, they don't like giving it back.
If they get money, they don't just give it back or stop taking it. No, yeah, you're right.
And
like once the government charges more money for something or gets more money, they're not going to just give it right up.
Right.
I think we all agree on that.
I also will add real quick.
There's human. Yeah.
Oh, just real quick. I forgot to mention. Income tax is progressive, so rich people pay more. Tariffs are regressive. So in effect, poor people end up paying more, partially because a flat tax will be regressive just based on marginal utility, or just based on the fact that a flat tax is a flat tax on a good. If it increases the price of a good by $1, that's a higher percentage of a poor person's income than it is a rich person's income. So it is still regressive. And secondly, poor people just import more good or just buy more imported goods, so they end up being affected more by this. And it's important to mention, the bottom 50% of people just do not pay that much in income tax. Like the average is like $600 in income tax for the bottom 50% of people. The standard deduction is like $14,000 or whatever. But these are people who would be paying a lot in tariffs. So, if we get it, certainly it is distributionally negative to say, get rid of the income tax and put tariffs in place. That's gonna end up being.
As far as I'm aware, I think like 75% of all tax revenue is paid by the top upper percent, isn't it?
I don't know the exact percentage, but we have a pretty progressive tax and transfer system in the U.S., despite what the ultra woke lefties will say. But
yeah, our billionaires pay an ass load in taxes, or they're supposed to.
Yeah, I mean, I will say they do have a point when it comes to the top 400 people in the U.S. or whatever. A lot of those billionaires kind of can get around paying taxes just because of the buy, borrow, die, quote unquote loophole. And there are solutions to that. There are consumption taxes you can do that I think would be a solution to that. But listen, here would be an argument I would make actually is that consumption taxes do tax rich people when they consume goods. And I think a value-added tax is going to raise even just a 5% value-added tax is going to raise about as much revenue as 10% universal tariffs without these distortionary negative effects that tariffs have and without retaliation. We
have value-added tax in Europe.
Right. I don't think there's a coherent argument to be made that tariffs, 10 or 20% universal tariffs would be better than a 5% VAT. I think that's absurd.
And there's also, like I think you refer to it as a consumption tax, like on sugar products, like Coke and McDonald's or something costs, they put like 15, 20 cents on it, extra, or, but that's more like a government health policy to try to get people to use less sugar.
Right. Yeah. Right. So, those are, sin taxes, like, Pergovian taxes, externality taxes. And I think those are an efficient type of taxation, right? Like there, might be maybe moral implications of doing it sometimes or whatever. But I think generally we should try to raise as much revenue as we can from, firstly, what are called like resource rents, taxing economic rents, which are essentially unearned economic payments, because like, let's say, the supply of natural resources is fixed, and also nobody created natural resources. Therefore, like, it seems kind of is unproductive. It's not a valuable thing to earn any money for extracting resources beyond the cost of extracting them. That's why, Norway has like a socialized oil company, and that company takes its profits and invests in what's called a sovereign wealth fund. That fund grows over time, and like it's used to pay out pensions. Australia has a similar system, kind of. I think they have a like windfall profits tax on resource extraction. I forget exactly where that money goes, but I think you should fund as much possible by taxing resource rents. I believe
the Norwegian pension is like they've got like 5 trillion.
They have like. It's huge. They have like 300,000 for every person in Norway. I think it's incredible.
There was one thing I noticed about Australia. It seems to have a tariff on luxury goods. Like imported cars. It's a huge tariff. I mean, if you import like a Range Rover, $100,000 Range Rover, like they charge you $100,000 to import it. Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah, I mean, there are. I think there's something called an expenditures tax. Which is basically a type of progressive consumption tax.
That wanted to. Well, I don't know how into cars you guys are, but I had a buddy that wanted to import. What was it? I want to say it was a 2000 Nissan Skyline. He wanted to import one from Japan to Australia, and he, jumped through all the hoops and talked to all these people on the phone, and he ended up getting I think a lady on the phone. I don't know, but she basically told him the best way to import that car into Australia is to have it cut in half and then brought to you in the 2 pieces, and then you try to weld it back together, and then there you go, you got your car. And he was like, wait, is that the one way to do it? And she goes, that is the one way to do it. You have to have the car brought in basically 2 pieces. And he was like, well, what do you mean, like taken apart? And she goes, no. And he's like, do you mean cut through the frame of the car in half? And she was like, yeah. And I was like, well, long ways or short ways? Also, there haven't been enough bants, I guess, going back and forth between you two. The chat has gotten upset. So Cotton Ministry says, this NonFunGuy sounds like a transitioning troon. He's making fun of your voice.
True. Accurate. How do you know? True. Destroyed.
And the Panelverse says, Pizza Face Nonfon, the greasy punk. That should be the name of one of your streams.
Panelverse hates me, and I don't know what I did to him. He's coming to my chat a few times. I've seen him in a Convoy chat, and like
plays around.
I have no clue. He was friendly to me for a while. I really don't know what I did to him, but
I don't know. I try to have mutual respect. I don't know. I think Panelverse does have a channel. Yeah.
I've seen his channel.
Yeah. He posts clips from different things. We got about 5 minutes, and we'll switch to open panel. So if you guys want to,
one thing that we do over here, is a lot of government tax revenue comes from alcohol and cigarette taxes.
Mm-hmm.
We get like they fund our health service.
Yeah. I mean, that's like I said earlier. I think the first thing you should start doing for revenue is just start looking at resource rents, and then I think you should go to externality taxes. Taxing things that are what we consider kind of like socially bad, maybe the emissions of carbon or sugar, which makes people fat, or cigarettes, which have these negative effects. And then you can start looking at, consumption taxes. And tariffs are just a really, really bad tax. They don't really fit into any of those categories. They do tax consumption, but they also end up taxing investment, and they can reduce labor supply by reducing the after-tax return to investment. They're just a bad tax.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned
Nonfon's
You
best friend
mentioned
in my
green
chat
energy.
is,
I mean,
sorry, Shane.
yeah,
Nonfon's
you mentioned.
best friend in my chat, though, he says, "Fuck you, Nonfon. Take a shower." That's Panelverse.
Yeah, I don't know why the guy hates me so
Boy.
much.
Sorry, Shane.
It seems like no. Look, I would like us to get to alternative energy, and I would like us to in a good way. You know, I see a lot of you know, they're chopping down forests to build solar farm, or they're buying up local small holding farms to try pull farmers out of business. I don't like that. You know, and I see wind. You know, as far as I can tell, like they're only capable of generating like 10-11% of the need at the moment. You know, that might change in the future.
So I mean, I'm not a green energy expert, and it feels like we basically all agreed on nuclear energy earlier. I think nuclear energy we should start looking more into as well. But
yeah,
I mean, you know, people have done calculations of this. Like, obviously, there is a carbon footprint for building windmills and for building solar panels. But it seems like even taking into account like the maintenance of windmills, you get 10, 20 years of windmills, obviously with maintenance, but getting you carbon-free energy, that's just not something you get with like non-renewable sources. So it seems like over time they usually pay back their carbon debt or whatever. And I've
noticed that oil, for example, have gotten much cleaner in recent years. You know, over the last 20 years.
I don't know if that's true. It might be, but
well, they use synthetics and stuff like that too. And well, I don't think that we're quite ready for like the Green New Deal, right? Remember that? Everybody was throwing a fit about it, and they're like, "Oh, 2030." Well, even that's too soon, because we have to slowly start actually, putting something into it. We don't have to just like. I'm not for like canceling any kind of green energy. I don't want that, but it's like I think for some reason a lot of politicians are trying to make it look like they're rushing to do as much green stuff as possible. And it's like, well, we don't have the infrastructure in a lot of places. Like California often has like rolling blackouts because they don't have enough electricity to supply to everything. And running electric vehicles in that state. I think it's, I want to say California has like the most electric vehicles, but I could be wrong.
That wouldn't surprise me.
But I do know that a lot of
they also have the most people.
It wouldn't me either. Right. So it's like, if you're going to run all the electric vehicles, that's going to pull on the electric, the grid. You know what I mean? It's going to put more strain on it, as well as air conditioners and so on. And, well, when they would have like power outages for gas stations, they'd be running the fucking, the charging stations off of gas powered generators.
Right.
So it's like, if you're running an electric vehicle, you're still burning up gas. That's kind of asimine.
I can't speak
we're just not ready. Yeah.
I can't speak to California specifically, but like, I will say if you really any type of energy, they rely on imported equipment, and tariffs are going to tax that equipment. Seems like a bad thing. Seems
also,
like that would, yeah.
A lot of people want to argue about like, oh, we need less carbon emissions. We are carbon-based life forms. What does that mean in the long run? To like the weirdos, like the conspiracy theories, man. I love the conspiracy theories because it's like, oh, let's get rid of all the carbon stuff. Okay, well, we're people. We're kind of included in that.
There's no conspiracy. The position is we need to reduce CO2 emissions because of the greenhouse effect. There's no conspiracy there. But
the problem with the science on that is that the science is bad. And the estimates, like I'm talking like in the last 6 months, new research has shown that their models are like bad. They're like, they've overestimated the damage by like 50%. It's not as nearly as bad.
What do they say, that we put out so much pollution that we're putting out about 7 billion times what we thought the planet could handle?
Yeah, I mean, no, like the temperature is not only is it not warming, it's cooling. They were, and this is the third time they've been wrong. I mean, because when I was a kid, and even before I was a kid, they were talking. It was a global ice age. Then it was global warming, and now they're saying there was the ozone layer, and then they sort of fixed that, and then it transitioned to climate change. It's funny, like you can see
the ozone layer was fixed because of public policy. It was fixed because we literally.
Yeah, and they got rid of
the
CFC
ozone layer, and it's going to turn you into cancer. You're
It
going to
would have
become
if we
cancer.
didn't act.
And then everybody was like, you know what? Axe body spray. You know, that's that's everybody put on 2 gallons.
It was largely because of whatever refrigerants that we were using at the time. I think I forget what the type of chemical.
Yeah, they
it's
call them
called.
CFCs, I think.
Yeah, and those had negative
on?
effects on the ozone layer, and public policy acted in such a way to mitigate that effect, and to an extent,
And
like
unleaded petroleum products.
we've made a decent amount of progress on climate change. We've started switching to renewables. I just support continuing that transition.
I read recently that the surface of vegetative land, that's good for farmland in the world has grown by 20% in the last 20 years. Over, thanks to the models being wrong, and certain environmental policies have to try counteract negative results in the past, have helped.
Well, we got a dono from Mr. PFletch. He says, man-made climate change is a lie. Earth, gonna Earth. We're just along for the ride. Now, I tend to agree with George Carlin. George Carlin said in one of his stand-up specials that, everybody says that plastic's bad for the Earth, and that this and that the Earth can't produce it. Well, maybe Earth produced humans so that we would make plastic so that Earth could have it. And there you go. I agree with George Carlin. Taking care of business is here. I take care of business. Also, we're going to move into the into the open panel portion. So yeah, I mean, I'm still new to setting up these debates, so I'll put the link out there. If anybody wants to join, you'll be in the back for a little bit, and then I'll introduce y'all up. So go ahead, continue with your gay little discussion that you guys made me do on my live stream. God.
Well, no,
both of you.
I just think it's good to talk about these matters civilly without necessarily resorting to like screaming matches and fighting with each other. That's unnecessary, And I understand. Like, I'm not like
get yelled at.
Nonfon is an economics student, so like he knows more about this, or graduate, so you know more about this subject than I do, right? So I'm not going to like pretend to be an expert, and I'm not also going to be like completely partisan and just attack the other side, because there's good points on both sides. I think that in all economics there's trade-offs, in all public policy there's trade-offs,
I mean, I'll mostly agree with that, yeah. But the position would just be that tariffs, obviously, how overwhelmingly negative trade-off, essentially.
Yeah, it's a short-term band-aid for a long-term problem, Well,
I think trade is.
Well, I would agree that I think that we need a massive infrastructure investment. We need to future-proof the economy, or the investment, our infrastructure, our roads, our electricity. Everything needs a lot of work.
That's what Biden did. My man Biden infrastructure bill. It wasn't as expensive as I would have liked, but that was mostly because Republicans.
Were you a Bernie supporter, though? I meant to ask you that before.
No, I mean, so I don't, I'm a left-leaning guy, so like, I don't hate Bernie or anything, but I think Bernie has some kind of kooky ideas that I don't necessarily agree with. For example, a wealth tax I don't agree with. He has ideas of, putting farmers on the Federal Reserve. I think that was a stupid thing. I just the more populist policies of his I don't particularly like. And I think he plays into a lot of populist rhetoric that's just wrong, like saying a bajillion, quadrillion % of people are working paycheck to paycheck. That's just not really supported by the data. But like, I don't hate him. I would vote for him over Trump. I would vote for him over most Republicans right now. So.
Oh, that's fine. I don't have anything to say like super against Bernie. I don't really like him on a personal kind of level.
Right.
He's like the oligarchy, and we got to fight against the oligarchy and
millionaires and billionaires.
Yeah.
I do
like half of them people based on what I've seen from their personalities.
So here's part of my issue with Bernie is that I think a lot of the things that him and AOC are saying on that tour are I agree with a lot of it. I don't agree with some other things. And I think they, again, are playing in a populist rhetoric that is usually a lot of times just wrong and supports bad policies. But they're the ones fighting against Donald Trump right now. It just doesn't seem like we have we don't have these moderate Democrats really trying to stand up to Trump as much. And I hate it.
I feel like there's no fight to be had. The guy's already president. It's like,
well, a
you
guy
guys
is
can go ahead
president,
and
but
fight,
they're
fight, fight, but like pick something that doesn't seem like it's for your own personal gain. Like, in my opinion, I would ask them personally, like if I had any of them on my show, right? I would be like, all right, AOC, why do you dislike Trump so much? And how come you guys, none of the people on their side have said anything to the, anything, they've shown no proof or anything like that, that they're not just supporting USAID and DEI for their own benefit. They've not said anything about USAID. They've not said like, hey, that policy or that thing that USAID was doing was because of such and such. Like, none of them have come forward, right?
you don't think
But then
Democrats
you see all
have
the claims from Doge, and it's like, okay, they got shit to back it up. They got a website devoted to it, a Twitter page
Doge?
devoted to
Absolutely
showing you
no.
what they're
So
doing.
I mean, Doge specifically removed information from that website to make it harder for. I believe the New York Times had an investigation saying, "Hey, we looked into these programs that Doge reported to cut on their website, and it turns out like they did not save nearly as much money as they thought. As they say that they did because these programs were already like partially paid out or whatever.
Yeah.
And Doge
that's to be
removed that information to make it harder for these investigations to continue. That's not transparency. It's the opposite of transparency. Like,
It's still
that's insane. And
But the
Democrats
accounting on Doge is scary.
than we saw from the other side. Like, it's still more transparency than we see from the other side.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. The Inspector General is an independent agency. Obviously, they're independent. They're not partisan. But they release reports. They audit the Federal Reserve and release reports. They audit Social Security and release these reports. And the reason we know that Doge was lying, for instance, about the number of dead people getting payments on Social Security is because the independent Inspector General's report, actually knows the number of people receiving these payments. Like,
well, yeah, there was another point about that there's when they said there were people that are 120 years old, that there's a cutoff that's in the legislation that people aren't aware of. Like you can't get it.
So it's not just that though. They said like, I forget. I think they lied about the number of people being on it, but they also like they implied that all of them were getting payments. But like, even
They do
people.
imply that.
I think the
that's what I meant. Yeah.
Well, yeah. So I think there was a cutoff at 115 years of age, but they suggested that like even people over 100 were getting payments when like, I don't know. I think it's 98% of people who are super old on Social Security don't receive payments anymore. Like, even when they're below the cutoff age.
Somebody.
The thing that scared me was the education, the way that education money was being spent. 75% of the education budget was not going to students.
Do you mean the Department of Education?
Yeah.
So
it's being spent. It's just not reaching students.
Well, what I would so the biggest thing the Department of Education does is like manage student loans. So like I don't know if they're referring to like most of the Department of Education's budget does not go to like K through 12 schools. It goes to like giving students loans. So I don't know. They could be referring to that, but like that's still the money being spent efficiently. And actually,
in many countries. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so the Department of Education is actually a like pretty efficient department. I think it has for every dollar you spend in the Department of Education, I think 3.4% of that is spent basically on administrative cost, and the rest of it goes to students, or if not to students, it's at least spent, and that's relatively low administrative cost even compared to other agencies. And then the funding for the staffers in the DOE, that's funded separately than the actual appropriations to like the students and everything. So like if you reduce the staff of the DOE, you're not spending more money on students, you're just not paying staffers as much, or you're just that money I think just has to go back to Congress unless they raise the salaries of the people working in the DOE.
Got rid of the student loan debt forgiveness thing. That's off the table. Department of Education, that's already closed down. And I don't see people
the Department of Education
in the streets begging for money to go to school. So,
well, look. So number one, the Department of Education has not been fully shut down yet. They did do firing cuts, but as an agency created through Congress, Trump can't really unilaterally shut that down as much as he might like. They did cancel some of the student loan forgiveness stuff, and like. A lot of honestly, a lot of
crying about it. It's like, well, it wasn't forgiven yet. It was just on hold for, I think, 2 years. And
Yeah,
they
Well, some
came
of it,
down with
I think
the
some of
number
it was
that, like,
forgiven. I think
it's 60% of people that were on the temporary hold didn't make one single payment. So
yeah,
it's
that's
like, you're
never. It
still
was
supposed
never
pay
going to
into
happen. That
it.
was always unconstitutional. Biden didn't have that power.
no. So number
Yeah, he went
one,
around the
there
Supreme
was the
Court
original
to
plan
put
that
it
was
in.
struck down by the Supreme Court, and then Biden did a
Right.
more limited plan under a different law. That
Yeah, he used the
was,
War Powers Act, didn't he?
I don't know if it was the War Powers Act, but whatever it was never challenged in the court and shut down before he left office at least. But I believe, I don't know, I believe it was forgiven, and I think the GOP, I believe they literally uncanceled it. I think Trump wants to literally have people pay back what they thought was forgiven. Like, that seems unhinged. I don't think it's.
Well, it
I don't think it's just.
Well,
that it
no,
wasn't
I don't think it
paused.
should ever have been forgiven. I don't think it should
wasn't.
ever have been
Well, I
forgiven.
understand that, but
Yeah, it wasn't forgiven. It was just on hold. So
Well, I'm
it's
not-
like,
I don't-
Well, you don't have to pay
I don't
it
know if
right
that's
now,
true.
but you probably should. That's kind of what they were doing.
I believe Trippy's right. It was on hold. It was on hold.
If you want to chat with me live, sub here or go to Nonfon420 on Twitch or Kick via the links below. Once again, please like and sub to help with the algorithm, and consider sending a donation through YouTube Super Thanks to directly support me, and I'll make sure to reply to any question you ask. See you guys next time.